I want to talk about the months immediately after 9/11, where you had the first response by America to corner these Al Qaeda terrorists, and you had them hold out in the Tora Bora mountains, and there was extensive
Yes.
bombing that was going on, and you had
Yes.
a lot of these high value targets that were identified, but they just went over the passes into Pakistan and just dissolved into the ether over there. Why didn't
Yes.
America go into Pakistan then and get this done if you had such a close relationship with their intelligence?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I have several answers for you. First, the United States was reactive at the time rather than proactive. You remember we waited for more than a month before we started bombing Afghanistan.
Yes.
We were trying to be deliberate. We were trying to not let emotion cloud our judgment, and we waited a month until we had proper buildup in the region, and then we began attacking known Al Qaeda sites. Again, mostly in the Pashto areas of southern and eastern Afghanistan. Um, we believed in October of 2001 that we had Osama bin Laden and the Al Qaeda leadership cornered at Tora Bora.
Yeah.
We did not know that the translator for the commander of Central Command uh, was actually an Al Qaeda operative who had infiltrated the US military.
Oh, wow.
And so we knew we had bin Laden cornered. We told him to come down the mountain. And he said through the translator, "Can you just give us until dawn? We want to evacuate the women and children, and then we'll come down and give up." The translator convinced General Franks to approve this idea. What ended up happening was bin Laden dressed as a woman, and he escaped under the cover of darkness in the back of a pickup truck into Pakistan. And so when the sun came up at dawn, there was no one in Tora Bora
Yeah.
to give up. They had all escaped. And so we had to move the fight to Pakistan proper. Now, you're right, our relations with the Pakistani government were very, very good. It was General Pervez Musharraf at the time. And look, let's be honest here. The United States loves working with dictators
Yes.
because then you don't have to worry about public opinion and you don't have to worry about the media.
Hmm.
And so we essentially just purchased Musharraf. We gave millions and millions and millions of dollars in aid, whether it was military aid or economic development aid. And we would meet with Musharraf regularly, several times a week. And essentially, he would let us do whatever we wanted to do.
Yes.
But Musharraf also had his own people that he needed to deal with. He had to keep the military happy, and the military didn't care about Al Qaeda, they cared about India.
Yep.
And so, in order to keep the military happy and keep some of the extremists happy, he had to allow them to continue this dual life of pretending to cooperate with the Americans on counterterrorism while committing terror
Against
against
India.
India.
December 2001 was when the parliament attack also happened
Yes.
in New Delhi. So this is kind of coinciding also with when your presence in Pakistan as well, or was it
Yes.
in
I
2002?
got there. I got there 3 weeks, 2 weeks later. Yes.
Okay, so you're running ops now. You're giving all this aid to Pakistan, but you're also seeing a lot of this being routed to uh, terrorist groups active, but basically propped up by Pakistan and Pakistan's ISI. What was the situation like when you were in Islamabad or wherever you were in your position when Operation
Mhm.
Parakram happened, where India and Pakistan were almost at the brink of a nuclear war back then in 2002?
I'll tell you a funny story about that. Um, Family members had been evacuated from Islamabad. So everybody who was working in Islamabad was working alone, right? There were no family members there. Well, then there was a second evacuation. So it was only
Why were
essential
they, sorry,
personnel
why were they evacuated? Sorry.
because we believed India and Pakistan would go to war.
Hmm.
Yeah. So we just evacuated. This is actually not uncommon in the American Foreign Service. I worked in the Middle East for years, and we went through at least 5 evacuations over the
Hmm.
course of my career. Yeah. Kuwait,
Yeah.
Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. We were constantly evacuating family members.
Okay.
So I had a very young first tour female officer working for me as my assistant. And we went to lunch one day in the embassy cafeteria. The cafeteria was enormous. It probably held 400 people, gigantic. And in fact, on weekends, it would double as a nightclub. There would be bands that came in and would play cover songs, and a disco ball would come down and spin around, and people danced. We went down at 12 o'clock noon one day for lunch.
Hmm.
And when we got into the cafeteria, we were the only ones in the cafeteria. And she said to me, "Where is everybody?" And I said, "Are you kidding?" And she said, "No, where is everybody? It's 12 o'clock." And I said, "They've been evacuated." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Because India and Pakistan are going to go to war with each other, like at any minute now." She
Wow.
said, "They are?" And I said, "Didn't you notice the helicopter in the parking lot?" And she said,
Right.
"Yeah." I said, "And you didn't wonder what it was there for?" She said, I didn't think of it. I said, "It's there to rescue us."
Hmm.
And then the Deputy Secretary of State came in and
Hmm.
shuttled between Delhi and Islamabad and negotiated a settlement where both sides backed off, and then everybody came back. But the moral of the story is that we were so busy and
Yeah.
we were so focused on Al Qaeda and Afghanistan, we never gave two thoughts to India. And I'll tell you another thing. Just a couple of months later, in March of 2002, we raided a Lashkar-e Taiba safe house in Lahore.
Okay.
And in that house, we captured 3 Lashkar-e Taiba fighters who had with them a copy of the Al Qaeda training manual. And it was the first time analytically that we were able to connect Lashkar e Taiba with Al Qaeda. The very first time. I remember receiving a cable from the deputy director of the CIA for intelligence, congratulating us on finding this training manual, saying it was the very first time that we could attach the Pakistani government to Al Qaeda.
What stopped you from going after Pakistan then? You have the first smoking gun of a inextricably linked ISI, because the LET or the JEM, JUD,
Mhm.
the various names that they come up with are
Yes,
essentially ISI proxies propped up by the
yes,
Pakistani government, and now they have a direct link with
correct.
Al Qaeda. Uh,
Yes.
why didn't you ever bring this up?
That was a decision that was made at the White House. And the decision was that the relationship is bigger than India Pakistan, at least temporarily. The relationship, we needed the Pakistanis actually more than they needed us at that point. We were happy to throw money at them. That's what they responded to.
Hmm.
But we really needed them to let us base our drones in Balochistan, for example, have what's called a picket line.
Hmm.
CIA officers all the way up and down the border with Afghanistan
So from Waziristan all the way down to
to
Balochistan.
Balochistan. Mhm.
Wow.
We needed a presence in Peshawar. We needed a presence in Quetta. We needed a presence in Karachi and Lahore. And we needed for them to say yes to everything that we wanted to do.
Hmm.
And so a decision was made at the White House that if we strategically ignore this terrorism problem vis-a-vis India, the relationship would be much easier to negotiate. And so that's what we did. I'll tell you one other thing. Years later, in 2008,
Hmm.
I had left the CIA. I had blown the whistle already, and I was working as a counterterrorism advisor to ABC News, one of the big news networks here in the
Yes, of
United
course.
States. And and I got a call saying, "Are you watching the news?" I said, "No." It was the night before Thanksgiving, so it's a major American holiday,
Right.
major holiday. I said, "No, I'm not watching the news." Uh, there's been an enormous terrorist attack in Mumbai. They're attacking hotels, they're attacking Jewish centers, they're attacking this and attacking that. I said, "Oh my God." They said, "Can you come into the studio and talk about this?" I said, "Of course." Everybody else was on vacation because it's the eve of a major holiday.
Yes.
So I jump in the shower, I shave, and as I'm getting dressed, my wife, who was still in the CIA at the time, she said, "You should watch, while you're getting dressed, you should watch what the other networks are saying about this." So I go to CNN. They said, Al Qaeda. I go to Fox, Al Qaeda, MSNBC, it's Al Qaeda. And these are all friends of mine who are saying it. And
Yeah.
I said to my wife, "I don't think this is Al Qaeda." She said, "Wow, you better really be sure of yourself if you're going to put your reputation on the line and tell the entire country that this
Yeah.
is not Al Qaeda." So I drove down to ABC News to the studio
Hmm.
and they wired me up. And I was talking to the reporter in New York. And I said, "Listen, I don't think this is Al Qaeda. I think this is the Pakistani supported Kashmiri groups." I said, "Al Qaeda doesn't care about India. They don't have any problem with the Indians. Their
Hmm.
fight is with us."
Yes.
And he said, "Oh my God." He said, you're going to need to be 100% sure because everybody is saying it's Al Qaeda." And I said, I was in the CIA long enough that I can say that I feel strongly this is not Al Qaeda. And so I went on the air and I was the only person that said, "I believe that these are Pakistani Kashmiri separatist groups supported by the Pakistani ISI."
Right.
And that turned out to be exactly the case, to
Bingo.
the
Yeah.
point where ABC News made television commercials saying, "ABC News, the Mumbai attacks, we were the only ones that got it right." But
Right.
there was a bigger issue here, bigger story here. And the story was that Pakistan was committing terrorism in
Right.
India, and
You,
nobody did anything about it.
in your experience, India showed restraint after the parliament attacks, right?
Greatly,
Yes.
greatly.
Showed restraint after the Mumbai attacks of 2008.
Yes, indeed.
But they didn't show any restraint this time around when Operation Sindoor happened in Pahalgam, where it was a
Yes.
4-day high intensity sort of war that happened. What do you think changed over in the course of these 2 decades?
At the CIA, we called the Indian policy strategic patience. The Indian government would have been perfectly within its rights to respond by striking Pakistan, and they didn't. And I remember at the White House, people were saying, "Wow, the Indians are really exhibiting a very mature foreign
Hmm.
policy here. We expected the Indians to strike back, and they didn't." And that kept the world from what might have been a nuclear exchange.
Right.
But India's gotten to the point where they can't risk strategic patience being misunderstood as weakness. And
Right.
so they had to respond.
Right.
Now the question now that CIA analysts are likely asking themselves are, did the Pakistanis learn their lesson? Not to keep poking the hornet's nest and expecting to not be stung.
I'm glad that you brought up the nuclear angle, Mr. Kiyaku, because during your time in Pakistan, 2002, 3, 4, around that time,
Mhm.
another very dangerous threat to humanity was Dr. A.Q. Khan's
Oh,
network,
yes.
right?
Yes, yes,
So we got to know that nuclear material was being smuggled out to the North Koreans. Uh,
yes.
there was proliferation going on with Libyan nuclear material as well going into Pakistan. All of that started coming out. When you were there in Pakistan, when
Yes.
you got this on your desk, what was the first thing you thought? You guys are going after terrorists. Here's Pakistan assembling nuclear bombs and selling it in the gray market or black market.
That's an outstanding question and a very important one. It never crossed my desk. I was specifically counterterrorism, but a colleague of mine, this was his entire life, was dealing with AQ Khan. Well, if we had taken, the Israeli approach, we would have just killed him. He was easy enough to find. We knew where he lived. We knew how he spent his day. But he also had the support of the Saudi government. And the Saudis came to us and said, please leave him alone. Please. We like AQ Khan. We're working with AQ Khan. We're close to the Pakistanis. They even named Faisalabad after King Faisal. Just leave him alone. This was a mistake that the US government made, not confronting AQ Khan head on. And I'll add too, later on, when I went to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff as the chief investigator, I worked for a man who was a journalist before going to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff. And he and his wife wrote a book that was first titled The Man from Pakistan. And the title was changed in the paperback version to The Nuclear Jihadist. It was the most detailed book ever written about AQ Khan.
Mm.
And they asked more than 24 CIA officers and United Nations IAEA officials exactly the same question that you just asked me.
Mm.
I was surprised that they got so many people to speak with them freely and openly. But they all told the same thing. They said that there were instructions from the White House not to attack AQ Khan. And it had to be because the Saudis were demanding it, insisting on it. We often wondered, and I have no proof, this is just my own speculation. We often wondered if it was because the Saudis were also building a nuclear capability.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's something we should probably be thinking about.
Well, when you put this into context and you talk about the Saudi-Pakistan Mutual Defense Pact that was just signed a few months ago,
Yes,
is Saudi Arabia basically calling in its investment?
I think yes. But I have to laugh about this mutual defense pact.
Mm.
I don't know if you've ever spent any time in Saudi Arabia,
No,
but
I haven't.
almost the entire Saudi military is Pakistanis. No Saudi's going to join the military unless they're going to make him a general. You
Uh,
know, there are a lot of Bedouins in the Saudi military, but you go straight in as an officer. If you're a Saudi citizen, you're going to start as an officer. There are no privates or corporals who are Saudi. They're all Pakistani. All of them. It's the Pakistanis that protect Saudi Arabia
but how realistic is a
on
nuclear
on the
umbrella, though?
ground.
But how realistic is a nuclear umbrella, though? That's what is, I mean, at least some of the doomsayers in India think of it like that.
Yeah, I don't think it is realistic.
Yeah.
No, I
So
don't think it's realistic.
when this AQ Khan thing happened and it was brought up, what was this Saudi Arabia hold on America? Now you have Saudi terrorists taking out the 9/11 towers,
That's right.
Saudi Arabia actively lobbying to protect one of the most dangerous men, at least in the last quarter century, at least in this region. And then
Yes,
eventually Pervez Musharraf also pardoning AQ Khan, therefore ending all investigations. What is this
that's right.
compulsion that America has with dictators and this love story?
That is one of the most difficult questions that you could ask. We like to try to convince the world that we are a shining beacon of hope for democracy and human rights and equality, and it's just simply not true.
Hmm.
Our foreign relations, um, our foreign relations are based on our national needs at any given moment. We don't do things because they're the right thing to do.
Hmm.
We do them because they happen to be good for us that day, which is why we get into bed with so many dictators around the world, which is why we get into bed with so many politicians who are so extreme in their personal politics that it makes no sense to the American people. Why are we in bed with Benjamin Netanyahu right now
Right.
when
Right.
we've known Netanyahu since the 1980s as an
Yes.
extremist?
Yes.
Because it's the easy thing to do and it serves our purposes, today. That may change tomorrow, but today it's okay. I worked for an ambassador in Bahrain who was an absolutely lovely man. And he said one day, I still remember this. I was young and impressionable, and he said, our foreign policy in Saudi Arabia really is as simple as we buy their oil and they buy our weapons.
That's it.
That's it. That's it. That's the basis. He said, you spend your career in the Middle East. I've spent my entire adult life in the Middle East. He said, I don't like the Saudis. They don't like us. But we pretend to have this special relationship, right? Even in the American embassy, my first overseas tour was in Saudi Arabia. And I
Hmm.
remember an enormous photograph. It had to be 2 meters across. And it was President Franklin Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
in the back of a car together. And this was supposed to be emblematic of our special relationship with the Saudis. But when I first arrived in Saudi Arabia, um, I was placed in embassy housing. So I was living in an apartment in the diplomatic quarter, and I would walk a block or two to the embassy and go in the back entrance of the embassy. And every day, my first 3 days, I would say to this Saudi guard, national Saudi Arabia National Guard officer standing there, Salamu alaikum. The
Well,
response, of course, is Walaikum assalam.
yes.
He would ignore me. So the next day, I went in and I said, Salaam alaikum.
Hmm.
And he ignored me. The third day, I went in and I said, Sabah al khair wa assalamu alaikum. Good morning
Right.
and peace be upon you. He ignored me. And I stopped and I said to him, what's your problem? And he said to me in English, he said, you are hired help. We paid for you to come here and defend us. We are not friends.
Hmm.
And I said, you know what? You're right. We aren't friends. I don't like you, and I don't like any of your compatriots. None of them.
Right.
And then I never spoke to him again. But that was the US Saudi relationship in a nutshell.